Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. So today is the Rebbitzon's birthday, Adar. Later in the day, we'll have a short class on significance of this day, significance of birthday, Bechlal, and a little bit about the Rebbitzon, and a little bit about why a birthday is so significant according to Torah. And there's just one thing to remember is that on the day of a birthday, the person's mazel is the strongest. So it's certainly a day that's conducive for bracha, especially for women who are so connected to the Rebbitzon. But that's the explanation of the balloons and the cookies that you saw downstairs, if you were wondering. Okay. We are on page 4, and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines from the bottom. We're in the line that begins with the word Shelo, Shin Lamed Vav, and we're in the middle of the line Vihine. So after we explained what eating matzah is all about, and how the nefesh Elokis is capable of experiencing bittul b'metzius, and the nefesh Elokis, that part of you has to inspire the nefesh Bahamis that it should have at least the feeling of bittul hayesh. And this process is Yitzias Mitzrayim on a personal level. V'hinei, derech prat, to be more specific and on a personal level, tzarech liyas Yitzias Mitzrayim b'chol yom. This is something which we have to experience every day. Ach b'chlolos hashana, but if you look at the year in general, there's one time that's designated for this, hu b'Pesach. In other words, just like, for example, the mitzvah of remembering Mitzrayim. What's the big deal about Pesach? Every day we're supposed to remember Mitzrayim. In what way is it different? It's a question that Mefarshim, commentators, ask, and there are different answers given. But generally, the answer is, on a very simple level, that all year around, we also mention Yitzias Mitzrayim, amongst many other things. But Pesach, that's the time that the primary focus is all about going out of Mitzrayim. So the same is here. This Avodah of personally going out of Mitzrayim is every single day of the year. But when do we get the koyach? This is a little bit deeper according to Chassidus. When does Hashem give us, empower us with the ability and the potential to be able to accomplish this? This is on Pesach. So on Pesach, nimshach hakoyach hazeh l'nefesh Elokis. That's why nefesh Elokis gets this koyach. Shetuchal l'zachech l'nefesh Bahamis. And literally, you can think of this what? Yeah, you can think of this as an injection, where a person sometimes gets, let's say, a flu shot. Once a year, you get a flu shot. You don't get it every day. You get it once a year. Or now the controversial, or not controversial, but the big thing is the vaccine. You don't get a vaccine shot every day. You get a vaccine shot, and that creates something that's going to protect you. And hopefully, for the future, this will protect you. You don't need it again. Now I hear they say you might need it every 6 months, but we won't talk about that. So Baruchnius, there's once a year that Hashem gives us this spiritual injection, which is on Pesach. And with this injection, he injects in us the koyach to have this amunah. That's on Pesach. And it's in us, b'yosed baltimet, it's like nailing it in, and it becomes permanent. Li'yismeir begili b'meicha v'libay, that we should feel it consciously in our minds and our hearts. And how does Hashem give it to us on Pesach? Adei hamatzah kenal. Shenitztavinu loichla b'leil tezvav b'nisan. We were commanded to eat it on the 15th night of Nisan. In other words, if you eat matzah in the middle of Chanukah, it might taste good, but it has nothing to do with this. You have to eat matzah that's baked al pi halacha. You have to eat it on Pesach, and you have to eat it on the first night of Pesach. If you do everything in the right conditions, then it's going to Oz nimshach ma'meichen hanal b'chlolos neshamas Yisrael. Then Hashem injects in all the Yidden this light of Hashem that comes from His Chochmah. Hameir b'moken neshamas Yisrael shalamayla. So Hashem injects this in the source of our neshama up there. And from there, it flows to every single neshama down here. This is the hidden secret in matzah. So, to a certain extent, this is almost the conclusion of the whole Mamar. We have one more small piece. I know you're looking at the page and you see there's much more. But if you remember, we skipped the beginning because there was so much Kabbalah. So we're going to skip the end because there's also a lot of Kabbalah. But there's another few lines we're still going to do. Before we do those few lines, I wanted to go into another thing. And that is, remember, we said one of the differences, whether you look at the world as bitl hayesh or bitl b'mitzias, which sounds like philosophical concepts, or what would be the difference on a more down-to-earth level? The difference would be in how we view Hashgacha Pratis. If we understand that Hashem and the world are absolutely one, in the most absolute way, then we realize Hashgacha Pratis is really very specific and every single detail of life. And if we look at the world that it's a yesh, it has its own identity, has its own independent existence, but Hashem is like the neshama that gives life to the body. But just like the body has its own identity, it's flesh and blood and muscle, tissue, all these physical, biological things, which is not the neshama, that's how the world also has its own identity. Then this would mean that there could be certain things that are happening in the world that are happening independent of the Hashgacha Pratis. So I chose a Mamar. I mentioned it the other day. It's a Mamar of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Unfortunately, we don't have an English translation, so I'll try to read it slowly. But the Mamar, I think, is unique. I don't think I found anything else close to it that explains and elaborates what Hashgacha Pratis is, how specific it is, according to the teachings of Baal Shem Tov. So I'm going to pass it around now. And I think that those of you online, I think you got it from Mrs. Yafi. So it's a Mamar that the Frierdiker Rebbe said in Tov Reish Tzadik Vav, which is 1936. And in the Mamar, there's this part where he elaborates on Hashgacha Pratis. Page 1, we're starting with page 119, where you see it underlined. 119, where it's underlined. If you learn this Mamar and you think about it and you learn it enough times, then you'll see Hashem wherever you turn. Whatever it is in the Mamar that is going to explain, everything in creation. Kol HaNevroim means everything that was created down here. Kulam, all of them, nechlakim b'daled madreges keilulim. They're all divided into 4 general categories. And those general categories are daimim, inanimate, Tzemeach, the plant kingdom, Chai, the animal kingdom, Medaber is the human kingdom. These are the four categories. Everything in the world will fall into one of these four categories. Asher kol echad medalad elu, but these four, each one of these four, koilulim, they all include, turn the page, minim rabim beribui muflim. Each one includes many different categories within each one, and it's vast how many details there are in each one. For example, when you talk about daimim means things that are inanimate, which means there's no life. There's no human life, no animal life, not even plant life, nothing, it's not no growth, no movement. But nevertheless, kailul ribui minim, there are different, so many different kinds. We're doing this, Mrs. Horowitz. So there's different categories in the daimim. For example, Afar, there's earth, Avanim, stones, Matches, metal, v'chulu. The kol echad mehem batzman, in each one, whether you talk about earth or stones or metal, there's also so many different categories. Like earth, we know there's certain earth that's good for one thing, good for agricultural purposes. Other earth is good for building purposes. And not only that, the Gemara says there's different earth that's good for certain things to grow there. There were people who were such experts, they were able to taste the earth and tell by that what's the best thing to plant in this piece of land. So there's different kinds of earth. And of course, when you talk about stones, there's ordinary stones, there's big stones, there's little stones, there's nice stones, there's precious stones, there's diamonds, there's pearls, and it goes on and on. So each one has many different kinds within itself. And each one of the details, they have ribi pratim, they all have details. B'li mispar, it's countless. That's the inanimate. Of course, the same is in the plant kingdom. There's so many different kinds of plants, and each kind has so many details, and even each detail has so many details. And the same with humans. So we know that there are, how many people are there in the world? Right now, there are a few billion people in the world, and each one is different than the other. So many different categories of people, but in each category, there are different kinds of people. And in each person, there's so many details. We just read about the cells in the body, the DNA in the body, details upon details, endless. Asher kol echad ve'echad ma'aprotim ha'mufrotim, each one of these details, asher b'min echad, within each category, yesh le chayes miyuchad umugbul, has a very specific chayes, life force from Hashem, umugbul loy, and it's designated to that particular creation. Asher chayes ahi, that life force is its soul, hamagadloi umanhigoi, that leads it, l'chol prota inyonav, in all its details. In other words, just like physically, this plant is different than another plant, this vegetable is different than another plant, and this person and this animal is different than another one, and this rock and this stone is different than another kind of stone. In each one, there's also a nefesh, a soul that gives it life, because nothing can exist without Hashem. So the life force in one is also different than the other. We've had this many times where it says that even grass, a blade of grass, each blade of grass has a malach, an angel that's in charge of it. And that angel, which is its life force, is what makes it grow. And if you remember, we brought up in class that he's going to bring this a little bit later in the Mamar. We brought up in class that scientists have discovered that each blade of grass has its own imprint. Just like there's fingerprints, that every person's finger is different than another person's finger. That's how even a blade of grass has certain print in it that makes one different than the other. And the reason is because they are different. Each one is an individual. So just like physically each one is an individual, there's also a soul, which is also very specific in each one separately. And this leads it, from the beginning of its life, until the last day of its life, the kol of nifsid, when it becomes no longer in existence. So to give an example is using one example in the plant kingdom. Let's understand this using the example of the plant kingdom. There's so many different categories in the realm of plant kingdom. Ilonis, there are trees. Tvuos, there's grain. Yerokos, there's vegetables. Asavim, there's deshoyim, there's grass. B'chol min, and in each one, yeshribui muflik. There's so many different kinds within each one. You lost me? Where I'm up to? We'll start with the word kamay. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines from the top on page 120. Kamay bilanas. Let's take, for example, trees. Ribui otzim. There's so many different kinds of trees. Hachalukim zeh mizeh. They're so different one from the other. Be'etzem muhusam. Ubepirium. First of all, the tree itself is different one from the other, and then the fruit of the tree is so different one from the other. And the same is with grass, or deshoyim. They're so different, they have different properties in them. Some of them are plants that have in it the property to bring health. Some of them have the property to, God forbid, kill. So therefore, there's so many medicines that come from plants, but each one is a medicine for something else. And this comes from this plant, and that comes from that plant. And then, of course, there's drugs, which also come from plants, and they do the opposite. They destroy lives. They're also different b'mareim, the way they look. Their form and their shape is not the same. The tivam and their nature is not the same. And each one of these kinds, there's endless amount of different kinds of in each one. So all these different kinds, just like they're different physically, it's also different in a sense in the chayas, the life force. In other words, just like people, there are 8 billion people in the world today, and each one looks physically different than the other, but each one also has a different neshama. You look down at a street like in Manhattan, where there are hundreds of thousands of people walking. Generally speaking, all the people look the same: 2 eyes, a nose, 2 ears, a mouth, hands and feet, different colors of clothing, and they dress differently, they speak different languages. These are all external. Then on top of that, there's a neshama. And each person has a different life and a different background, different personality, different life experiences, different feelings. It's endless, the differences. That's the way it is, not only with humans, but even with these plants. Because that chayes is nafshe hamachayos, it's like a soul that gives it life. Matzmichai, that's what makes it grow. Umegadloi, umanhigoi b'chol protein yonah b'chol tanoisav, all its movements. Me'eis tseisei mibetno adama, from the moment that this plant grows out of the ground, ad rega achrein, until it's the end of its life. The end of its life is when it's no longer growing. Shabbat kitzoi, that its end comes, and that is apigzeres hashgacha. The end of this plant, of this blade of grass, of this flower, is by hashgacha pratis. In fact, even the way it ends is by hashgacha pratis. Imli kotzer b'chermesh, is it because someone will cut it down with a special tool that's used to cut flowers or grass? Umagal yad, lahavi to'elas hanira b'mira balachayim, and that's for the purpose of using it to feed it to animals, or liyos lemirmus regel bliteres nina, or sometimes it's destroyed because it's being trampled by animals or humans that are trampling on it, and there is no benefit. Oily is kolav and nipsid beis boz manai, or it just its time comes and it doesn't grow anymore. All this abidin mishpat hashgacha al yena. There's actually a judgment in the Shemayim in heaven that Hashem makes that judgment and that decision. How the end of this blade of grass or this plant or this tree or whatever, how that should take place. Because kol echad yeshla nafshay haproti. Each one has its soul. Shezeu chayusei manhiga. That's its life force, and that's what leads it. V'lochen kol desha proti yeshli tzir miyuchad. And that's why every blade of grass has its own form. Which means, even though all grass, generally speaking, looks the same, and they seem to have the same properties, but nevertheless, each one has to have something specific, and that's what I told you before, what science has today discovered, that there's actually a different imprint. And the reason why it's different physically is if you call echad, so just like we can think of a human being, that every neshama has a different purpose in this world, so therefore this neshama comes down in this body, it comes down in this part of the world, in this country, in this time in history, to these set of parents, on this specific day, and all that is planned by Hashem because of the purpose of that person and that neshama. So the same is also with the neshama that's in a blade of grass, the neshama that's in a flower, the neshama that's in everything has a purpose, and therefore it comes down to be in this blade of grass until to last so many years or so many months or so many days. Like our sages say, there is no blade of grass. We're not talking about grass, a whole landscape of grass, not a blade, one single blade of grass, that doesn't have an angel up there, hamak meaning in Shemayim in heaven, hamakabai that hits it, and commands it, gadel, grow. In other words, there's a spiritual force that makes it grow. Shua mazel haruchni. What is that? The nefesh. That's the soul of this plant. Hamachaya say that gives it life. Umanhigay b'chol protei arches chayav, and all the details of its life, of its plant life. Apigzeres hashgacha al yena, and all this is by the command of Hashem's supernal, supreme supervision, that he looks at everything in the world and everything has a purpose, and he's the one who decides all these details about these plants. Ukiyadu, as it's known, binyan hashgacha pratis, regarding the subject of hashgacha pratis, shemavar marena Baal Shem Tov Nishmas Seiden, how the Baal Shem Tov explains hashgacha pratis. Remember, the word hashgacha pratis means that every detail is supervised by Hashem. The idea that the world at large is Hashem is in charge, that's something which people always understood. So when there's wars, when there are hurricanes, when there's floods, when there's the market that crashes, big things that happen that affects everybody, but specific things, so even specific things, people that, well, something specific in a city, in a village, in a family, but then when it goes down to these kind of details about a plant, about what the plant should be like and when its life should end and how its life should end, that's also b'hashgacha pratis. But he goes on further. Lo zul buvad. Not only the whole protei truas hanevroim, that all the movements of everything in creation, the minaim and all the different kinds, he b'hashgacha pratis ma'beri yisbarach, it's all from Hashem. And this hashgacha is what gives it life.
Rabbi Majeski?
Yes.
When you're talking about how a plant has a soul, do you mind elaborating on that in terms of what do we know about like the difference between like a plant soul and an animal soul? And is it just the life force, or is there more to the soul than it just being a life force for a plant?
Good question. First of all, what we do know is just like that, even though there's a soul, but the soul that's in a plant and the soul that's in an animal and the soul that's in a human being are different in terms of one has much more potential than the other. Like animals don't have the potential humans have, and the life force in a plant is not what is in an animal. Doesn't have that potential, that capabilities. But all we see, the only manifestation of life we see in plants is the fact that it grows. In that sense, it's different than things that are inanimate. But your question is there a certain consciousness there to the soul? So there definitely is, but I don't know if that means that the plant itself, I don't know, but there is a spiritual entity that's sort of in charge of the plant, and that probably has a certain, because it says it's like a mazel, like a life force of Hashem that has a purpose, and it is what guides the plant how it should be. So I guess, yes, it has some sort of a consciousness, but it's in a much lesser quality than the life force in an animal and the life force in a human.
Okay, thank you.
But exactly how to describe it, I don't know. Maybe we can do a little bit of research. Maybe there's some place that elaborate on this more. I'm not sure. So what he's saying here is not only, there's two ways to look at Hashgacha Pratis. Hashgacha Pratis, when you think of it, means supervision. Hashem watches everything. He's aware of everything. It's much deeper than that. Look at these words. I'm reading 2 lines from the bottom. Hashgacha Pratis Zu, this supervision, which is very specific, is Chayes HaNivra V'Kiyuma. This gives life to the creation. In other words, the Hashgacha Pratis is actually the reason why it's doing what it's doing. Whether it's a worm, or whether it's an animal, or whether it's a person, or whether it's a plant, the reason why these things are happening is because there's a spiritual purpose in it. And that's the chayis that's leading it. When you continue reading this, it's sort of, I don't know anyway, it's overwhelming to say that how all this Hashgacha Pratis, but I'll try to explain that soon. Let's first see what he says. So the Baal Shem Tov says something else. First of all, that everything is by Hashem, not just created, but he's running everything. Second of all, not only general, but specific. And not just specific for humans, but specific for animals and for plants, and every single detail, everything about it. It reminds me of the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that he was once, as a child, out in the country, and his father, the Rebbe Rashab, was walking with him. This story was told by the previous Rebbe himself in his Sichos. And he says, the nature of children is when you walk by a bush, you walk by a tree, you tear off a leaf, you take it in your fingers and you squeeze it, and just no specific thought process. It's just the way people do. And his father said to him, the Arizal says that in a tree with many leaves, there are also many neshamas. So you just take it and you just destroy it like that without thinking. So it means there's a soul to it, there's a life force to it that has a purpose and has a goal and has its purpose and goal. And therefore, if we follow halacha, I guess there is a halacha that's called Baltashkis, which means you're not allowed to destroy anything that has a purpose. In other words, if it's something which is broken, it's garbage, you throw it in the garbage. That's what you're supposed to do. But if, let's say you just take a cup that's in perfect condition, and you're just in the kind of mood, you take it and you just break it, like children have a nature to do. And some adults also have that nature just because we need to do something with our hands. But the truth is what you're doing is called Baltashkis, just destroying something that still has a purpose. And that means if it still has a purpose, that means there's a soul in it, and that soul has to fulfill a purpose. The purpose will be when someone drinks from the cup or something else, and just destroying it is not allowing it to fulfill its purpose.
Wait, but Rabbi Majewski, how could you argue that when it's hashgacha pratis that cup would be crushed then? You know what I mean? Like in the same way that a blade of grass would be crushed under your foot, like the foot of children playing. Wouldn't it be the same with like if you drink from a cup and then you're like, oh, I'm bored, I'm just going to rip it up during class? Wouldn't that also be hashgacha pratis?
Right, but that's like saying, if I punch somebody in the nose and I say, but don't worry about it, it's hashgacha pratis, because how else would I be able to punch you in the nose if it wasn't hashgacha pratis? So how do we deal with that?
I think they're like slightly different, but I see what you're saying.
Now I'll tell you, this is a much broader subject, but the general answer to this question is that after something happens, we definitely can look back and say it was hashgacha pratis. That's true. But initially, when I have to make a choice what to do, what not to do, I can't say, okay, once I break the cup, it's going to be hashgacha pratis. Like someone told me, he has a very hard time making decisions. And guess what? Hashgacha pratis ends up making a decision for him because he doesn't do anything about it. And then something else happens. He wants to buy a house and he can't decide whether he should buy it or not. And he's thinking about it so long, someone else buys it. So hashgacha pratis helps him out, So unfortunately, hashgacha pratis takes over, or not unfortunately. We have a command in the Torah to do things in a certain way. We have to take care of our health. We have to not hurt another person. So therefore, I'm not allowed to hurt another person. The person who gets hurt has to say, if this happened, if Hashem allowed it to happen, obviously there's a purpose. But that doesn't give me the license to chas v'sholom do something, because I can't use the term hashgacha pratis before I did it and say it must be hashgacha pratis. So what do? I have to follow Torah. The Torah says, do not break or destroy anything that has purpose to it, that has a use to it. And if it does get broken, yes, then there's a plan for that also. There's a reason. But from my end, I'm the one that interfered with the process that was supposed to take place. So Baal Shem Tov says not only that everything has a purpose and it's being guided by Hashem, every single detail, but something even greater than that. The Tnua Prati, I'm reading the last line now on page 120. The Tnua Prati is the Nivra Prati, the specific nuance of this specific creation. Yesh lo yachas kloli leklolus kavanas habriya. Plays a role and plays a part in the whole purpose of the entire creation. In other words, if we say something's happening with hashgacha pratis, I'm not talking about where human beings make the wrong choices. Let's talk about things that are not going to make us go into that discussion. Things that are happening with hashgacha pratis by Hashem, with plants, with humans, with animals. So when something happens, not only that this had a purpose, but this is connected to the whole purpose of why Hashem created the entire world, all these 5,781 years. It's all part of that purpose, and the whole purpose would be incomplete if this blade of grass wouldn't be in this part of the world and this wouldn't be happening to it. God has a very big job. It's not so easy. Adar Dugma is giving an example. One movement of one of the blades of grass. Imagine this grass growing in the depth of a forest, or on a very high mountain or high hill, or in a deep, deep valley. It's a place where people don't go there. He's choosing specifically such a place that it's not a place where it involves humans, to think that it's about the human being, because people don't go there. This is in a deep forest. Nobody walks there in this jungle. Nobody walks in that deep, deep valley, and nobody's walking in these high mountains. But there is grass there. There's something growing. Not only that the movement of this grass in this remote place that is not affecting humans as far as our eyes can see, it moves to the right and it moves to the left. It moves forward and it moves backwards. Because that's what happens. If you watch a blade of grass, the wind is blowing. Sometimes it moves to the right, moves to the left, it moves forward, it moves back. These movements, throughout the lifespan of this blade of grass, it's all by Hashgacha. Shehu Yizbarach Gazar, Hashem decreed, and he said, this blade of grass, Yichye Chadashim Yomim V'Shoyz Ktuvas. This blade of grass, its lifespan should be so many months, so many days, and so many hours. Listen to this, and throughout this lifespan, Yiseh v'Yakov liyimino Yismailo l'fanav l'achayro mispar kazeh v'kazeh. It should be turning to the right so many times, to the left so many times, forward so many times, and move back so many times. Of course, it boggles the mind to even think about it. That's when you talk about one blade of grass. And try to imagine this is happening with millions and billions and trillions upon trillions of blades of grass and plants and insects all over the world, that they're all being guided by Hashgacha Pratis, and they all have a purpose why it's happening, and everything is calculated by Hashem. I remember once learning Tanya where it says that Hashem counts every step we make. And I said that years ago, when you would tell somebody count every step a person makes, wow, it's mind-boggling. Today, Baruch Hashem, it's very practical. People carry a phone on them or some other device. And at the end of the day, you take a look, it tells you how many steps you made today. Exactly. Whether it's 4,322 or 4,321 steps. So Hashem has a very, very, very sophisticated state-of-the-art computer, and he keeps count of every movement. So there's a kavanah, there's a purpose why this blade of grass is going to turn to the right and the left and forward and back. It's like the lulav. You shake it here and you shake it there, you shake it here and you shake it there. There's a reason why it's going into the north or south, east, west. And there's a reason why this blade of grass is shaking back and forth so many times. There's a purpose for it. Yeah.
In relation to Mishkan, where Hashem is constantly creating something, you're saying Mishkan is after that specific entity has been created, then what happens to it?
Right.
Beyond that,
right. Right. So in addition to that, is something even greater. The Tnuas Hadesha Prati Alazu, the specific nuances and movements of this specific blade of grass, Yeshla Yachas Kloli, it has a general connection and association with Klolos, Kavanas, Habriya, with the whole purpose of the entire creation, which means the Tziru V'ichud Kol HaPulas HaProtim, by combining and connecting all the different movements of everything that's in the world, which is Ribud above his Protim, meaning endless, countless, millions and billions and trillions, and who you can't even count it, that there is in all the creations and all the different kinds of things that exist. It's all part of the complete purpose of creation, as if to say that without this movement here, something would be lacking in the whole creation. That's the even a greater chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, just to say one word that we should at least be able to comprehend this on some level is, it wouldn't be hard if somebody would say, the Baal Shem Tov said, that Hashem chooses one thing in the world, one plant, one tree, and he's very specific about every movement. That wouldn't be hard to understand, even two or three. But what's mind-boggling here is to think of it that Hashem has this focus and concentration on millions and billions and trillions and chachillion things in the world. That's like, how could a mind even think of that? So the answer is, this comes up often, it's found in Tanya, is that the difference between finite and infinite is that when you talk about infinite, the biggest number and the smaller number are all the same. In other words, if you have a drop of water coming out of a dropper, one drop of water, does that have any substance, any significance in the presence compared to the Atlantic Ocean? The answer is yes. Because the Atlantic Ocean is also drops of water, except it's not one drop, it's millions and billions and trillions of times trillions and trillions of drops of water together. So you have the Atlantic Ocean. And the one drop is part of it. In other words, the Atlantic Ocean is finite. The drop of water is finite, but it's a small part of it. When you talk about infinite, one drop of water and the Atlantic Ocean combined with the Pacific Ocean and all the other oceans in the world, and that one drop, they're all equal distance from infinite. It really makes no difference, right? So if you think of it, so if Hashem is infinite, so therefore for him to think about how to make one tree move or one blade of grass move, and for him to think how to make billions and trillions of blades of grass, it's all the same. There's no difference. So when you realize we're talking about infinite, infinite is a whole different category completely. All this is really not about the blades of grass. It's about me. When I start my day and someone knocks over my cup and the coffee spills all over me, I'm supposed to think, Hashgacha Pratis. There's a purpose why today the coffee didn't happen, by the way, but I'm saying if it would happen, it's Hashgacha Pratis. If I missed the bus, it's Hashgacha Pratis. If I lost my keys, it's Hashgacha Pratis. If someone says something to me, it's Hashgacha Pratis. Yes, Abba.
But it's just interesting, it's just addressing like the Hashgacha Pratis in nature, but then I wonder if he's going to go into like, the free will, because I think it's easier to notice, okay, fine, Hashem is running nature, but like you're talking about, you get to pick up the cup, so it's harder for me to think, oh, this is Hashgacha, or like a more complex scenario, this is really Hashgacha Pratis, so this person had choice to hurt me, or etc.
Right, it's harder, but that's probably the reason why. In other words, when you learn about something that's not related to me, it's out there, it's easier to get the concept. Once you get the concept, then you can apply it to yourself. So yes, when someone does something to me, it's harder for me to see that it's Hashgacha Pratis because this person chose to hurt me. But the truth is, it is Hashgacha Pratis just the same. Whatever happens to me is Hashgacha Pratis. Yeah.
We talked about that exact scenario in Parsha yesterday with my leg.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how
We didn't negotiate about what we're going to talk about. It just happened. It's Hashgacha Pratis, yeah.
he talked about the tension between free will and Hashgacha Pratis in the context of someone like negatively influencing one's life. And he was saying that we have free will in the sense that Hashem lays out a bunch of choices for us to choose from, but then for each choice that we could choose, there's like kind of like a GPS when it has to like recalibrate, then there's like a path that is linked to that choice that you choose to bring you back to like the path that he wants you to be on.
That's nice. Okay.
But in a sense, like Hashgacha Pratis is after the fact. It's something
Only after the fact.
Before the fact.
Right.
It's not related.
Yeah, but the question is, if I got hurt because someone chose through their free will to hurt me, is that also Hashgacha Pratis? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
If Hashem allowed it to happen, then it must be that there was a purpose in this happening. I was meant to this happen to me. Okay. Just to mention, this is also today's the yahrzeit of my father, Yaakov Yehuda B'Chaim V'Tali Hertz. He was actually principal in Beis Rivka for almost 20 years, Beis Rivka schools, but he passed away a long time ago, unfortunately, very young. So today's his yahrzeit, and the class is in his house. Okay. So I'll be out a few hours today, and I'll be back a little bit later in the day.
What? Oh, I didn't even realize that I'm wearing it.